Georgia versus Florida. How's everybody doing? Good morning, it's Uncle Lou here. Yep, that's right, it's me, Uncle Lou. Live on YouTube. So this is not a trash talking video. That's coming on Friday in the Hype and Hate video. This is just my actual thoughts and kind of breakdown and preview and prediction of this weekend's cocktail party annual Georgia-Florida rivalry game. Obviously, Georgia's significant favorite in this game. Significant may be an understatement. It's the biggest spread in the history of this game. Georgia's a 22.5 point favorite as of 5 minutes ago, according to DraftKings. Not very many people are giving Florida a chance to win this game. For good reason, I think. I mean, Georgia has been ranked number one the majority of the season. They're ranked one now. They're undefeated. They've got a top 5 offense, a top 5 defense, and almost no matter what category you go by, whether it's total offense and defense or scoring offense and defense. And Florida has really struggled in year one under Billy Napier. Anthony Richardson, for all his potential and talent and athleticism, it just hasn't really come together for him on the field. He's had moments, the fourth quarter of the Utah game way back in week 1, I thought Anthony Richardson played great. I think without Anthony Richardson, Florida loses that game against Utah. He was great, especially on the last offensive drive of the game where Florida drove down the field and scored what ended up being the winning touchdown. And then I thought he played really good against Tennessee. And we've had a lot of fun kind of making fun of Tennessee's defense and using Anthony Richardson's performance against Tennessee as kind of proof of how bad their defense is. But the reality is he played a great game there. So we know he has it in him, right, to at least play better than what we see him play most of the time. He still has a severe turnover problem. Plagued him last year. It's plagued him again this year. And while I think Anthony Richardson does deserve some of the blame for Florida's offensive troubles, I also feel like he's not getting a lot of help on the outside at the skill positions either. And a lot of times, even in Florida's, what you would call down years for Florida, they've had some pretty good wideouts. And it's not that they don't have any talent at wideout right now, but if you look at Florida's group of wide receivers right now, I do feel like it's probably on the less talented end of what they normally have, right? They don't really have that one wideout that kind of scares you, like a game-breaking type of guy that a defense maybe would try to key on. Clearly, they don't have like a Kyle Pitts type of guy at tight end. It just feels like, and again, I'm not making excuses for Anthony Richardson. He hasn't been great. But he doesn't have the best supporting cast either, at least in terms of a passing game. Now, where Florida has had some success is with the ground game. I do like their running backs. Etienne has looked good. Younger brother, I guess, of Clemson running back from a few years ago. He's looked good. And, of course, Anthony Richardson, for all his downsides with throwing the ball, is extremely dangerous, deadly even, on the run when he chooses to use his legs, whether it's a designed run, which Florida does some of, or what you see more often, which is sort of just his scrambling ability in pass plays, whether, maybe there's nowhere to go with the ball. Maybe he gets under some sort of pressure in the pocket and has to scramble and extend the play. That's honestly where Anthony Richardson seems to be at his best. So that's going to be a struggle for Georgia defensively. Georgia's, defense has played well this year, but if you're looking for maybe one particular area where Georgia has struggled, it would be in sacking the quarterback. Now, I think Georgia has done a pretty good job overall of getting pressure on the quarterback, pushing him out of the pocket, making him get off his spot, making him run around, things like that. But in terms of just sack numbers, it's pretty abysmal, really, for UGA. At this point in the season last year, Georgia had 24 sacks. 24, which is great for 7 or 8 games into a season, right? This point in the season this year, Georgia has 7 sacks. So way off the pace from last year. Again, if you watch Georgia games, you will see that they do get pressure on the quarterback, but for whatever reason, the sack numbers just aren't there. Whether it's a talent issue with Georgia defensively, or which some people will say other teams are trying to get rid of the ball really, really quick, and so Georgia just doesn't have time to get home to the QB. I don't know. It's probably a combination of the two. I don't think Georgia has nearly as good of a pass rush overall as they had last year. And I also believe from watching some Georgia games, it's pretty obvious that teams are scheming to get the ball out quick. So I think it's probably a combination of those two things. But I do think it'll be important for Georgia in this game this weekend not to only get pressure on Anthony Richardson, but to get him on the ground. getting pressure on Anthony Richardson is not always a good thing because, like I said, that's when he's at his best. That's when he's the most dangerous, is when you get him under pressure and he has to elude or scramble or get out of the pocket and he decides to maybe take off downfield. That's where he can be at his best. So if you're going to get back there and chase Anthony Richardson, if you're Georgia, I think you got to get him on the ground. So that's kind of the Georgia defense versus Florida offense side of it. Other way around, Georgia's offense against Florida's defense. Florida's defense has been pretty bad this year. And one stat in particular that I heard somewhere, I can't remember if it was an article I read or a video I saw. Florida's defense on third down is atrocious. One of the worst in the country. Not just the SEC, but the country. Opposing teams are converting third downs against Florida almost 50% of the time. That's astronomical compared to your average team. And in the last 2 games against Power 5 opponents, the opponent is converting third downs against Florida at almost 60% of the time. That's bad. In any game, defensively, when you get the other team to third down, that's money down. It's time to make a play and get off the field, and Florida's got a really, really hard time doing that. And that's going to be bad for them in this game. Georgia, as good as they are offensively, and they are good offensively. I mean, you don't end up top 5 in scoring. Georgia's number 2 in the country in total offense. Number 2. I don't know that Georgia has ever been number 2 in total offense in the country. So Georgia's got a good offense. What they don't have is the ability to take the top off of an offense. You don't see very many 40 and 50-yard bombs from UGA. In fact, Georgia has 1 pass all year over 40 yards. It's a lot of, short screen passes, hitch passes, tunnel screens and bubble screens, swing routes to the running back out of the backfield, different things like that. Not that they don't throw the ball down the field at all. They do. But it's really a short to intermediate passing game with UGA. So Georgia offensively gets in a lot of third downs. They'll run the ball. They've been running the ball better the last couple of weeks than they were in the beginning of the season, so I give Georgia some credit there. But a typical kind of Georgia drive would be maybe, a 4 to 5 yard gain on first down, and then, maybe they throw one of these hitch passes or something on second down that picks up 2 or 3 yards, and all of a sudden Georgia's at a 3rd and 2, right? Those are the downs Florida is really struggling in, those third downs. And if at the end of this game you were to tell me Georgia's going to have a third down conversion rate over 50%, I'd tell you, well, Georgia's going to win the game, right? Florida's going to have to get off the field on third downs. I really, all trash talk aside, I just don't think Florida defensively is going to be able to slow down Georgia all that much or all that often. Again, it's not a Tennessee-style offense where you're going to see a bunch of 30, 40, and 50-yard touchdown passes. It's going to be long, methodical drives that really just wear a defense down over time. And I feel like that's what's going to happen in this game with Florida defensively. It wouldn't surprise me for this to be a relatively close game in the first half. If you look at last year's game, the final score is not really indicative of how the game went. Florida fans will remember, but this was a very close game until about 2 minutes to go in the second quarter. And Anthony Richardson and the Florida Gators offense had like 2 or 3 turnovers right there at the very end of the second quarter that Georgia capitalized on. And instead of going into halftime with a small lead, Georgia went into halftime with a significant lead, and the game was pretty much over at that point. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar in this game where it remains relatively close in the first half. I do think in the second half, though, the long drives by the Georgia offense, leaning on the Florida defensive front for the first 2 and 3 quarters of the game, and Florida's inability to get off the field defensively on third down, I do think that's going to be too much for Florida to overcome. If I'm looking for a way for Florida to win this game, I think obviously it comes down to Anthony Richardson, right? He's going to have probably an even better game than what he had against Tennessee. Now that game was on the road in a hostile environment, so in theory, maybe he could play better at a neutral site type place like Jacksonville. But I think that's what it would take. Anthony Richardson would have to obviously not turn the ball over. I mean, that's key. Anytime you're looking for an upset in college football, there's 2 or 3 things that people always say. And one of the first ones is, well, you can't turn the ball over if you're trying to pull off the upset. So, yeah, that's obvious. I agree. Anthony Richardson has got to avoid the sort of catastrophic turnovers that have really plagued him in his 2 years at Florida so far. And then same thing. It's just things you hear all the time. Can Florida do something special teams-wise, to steal momentum or can they get a special teams touchdown? Can they block a kick? Something like that, right? It feels like that's the kind of thing it would take in order for Florida to win this game. Things have not gone well for Billy Napier in year one at Florida. They're, 4-3 or 3-4, whatever they are. They've lost to Kentucky, Tennessee, and LSU. I think their only SEC win is Mizzou. Is that right? Utah, of course, was a great win for Florida. It turns out Utah's a pretty good team. I think they're just with 2 losses now. The one to Florida and then a loss to UCLA. So Utah's a pretty good team. That was a big win for Florida. It just feels like it's been downhill since then. Probably could have and maybe even should have lost that game to South Florida. They did beat Mizzou, like I mentioned. So we'll see. This is always a big game. I know it's not a make or break game for Billy Napier, his first year head coach. No one expects him to win. I know the Florida fans want to win. You always want to win, right? I'm talking about just kind of expectations nationally. Not a lot of people expect Billy Napier to beat Georgia this year in year one. They just don't expect it. So it's not a make or break game for Billy Napier. I do think it's important for Florida to avoid sort of the disaster scenario. Sort of, was it 2017, I think, when Georgia beat Florida like 42-7? Something like that could be bad. A loss like that is something that could potentially affect this year's recruiting cycle, which Florida's got a pretty good recruiting class. I think they're 4th or 5th in the SEC this year for this cycle coming up in recruiting, which is okay. It feels like at a place like Florida, you should be almost in the top 3 every single year. But again, Billy Napier's first year, you give him a break there. 4 or 5 is not bad in the SEC. But, a blowout loss in a rivalry game to the team that you're currently chasing, and let's just be real, Florida's chasing Georgia right now. There's been many a year in Uncle Lou's lifetime where it was the other way around, where Georgia was chasing Florida. The entire 90s come to mind, a lot of the 2000s. But for the last 10 years or so, it feels like Georgia's kind of been ahead of Florida, generally speaking. Florida has a few wins over Georgia in the last 10 to 12 years, but Georgia's been considered the better program overall over the last decade or so. And it does feel like you need to avoid just sort of the embarrassing blowout type of loss because of the potential negative effect that could have on this year's recruiting cycle, right? If you have some players that maybe look at that and decide to decommit or whatever. A close loss to Georgia in this game would not be embarrassing for Florida or Billy Napier, I don't think, because like I said, look at the point spread, 22.5, biggest in series history. You listen to people talk about this game, whether it's nationally on TV or radio or talking heads on YouTube like me or whatever. There's just not a lot of people outside the Florida fan base who expect Florida to win this game. So, no, not a make or break deal for Billy Napier, I don't think. Obviously, try to avoid the blowout, and we'll see what happens. I'm a Georgia fan, so you can take this with a grain of salt, I guess. I just don't think there's enough there with Florida this year for them to pull this off with a first-year head coach in Billy Napier. I don't trust Anthony Richardson to win a game like this. And Florida's defense, especially the third down numbers, I just feel like it's a bad matchup with UJ and the type of offense they run. So, good luck to both teams, I guess. One of the biggest rivalry games in all of college football, right? I mean, you got Alabama, Auburn, Michigan, Ohio State, Texas, Oklahoma. I think Georgia, Florida's right there with those rivalries in terms of the biggest rivalries in football. So it's a rivalry weekend kind of this weekend too, Doesn't get talked about a whole lot as a rivalry weekend, but you've got Georgia, Florida. You've got Michigan, Michigan State. Tennessee and Kentucky, which is a rivalry. Penn State and Ohio State. I mean, you've got some what you would consider to be rivalry games. Even maybe a few of those are just, regional rivals. A few of them may be national, but kind of a mini rivalry weekend. Of course, the last weekend of the regular season, a big rivalry weekend. When you have the Iron Bowl and Michigan, Ohio State, and Clemson, South Carolina, and Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Louisville, Kentucky, and all that. Mississippi, Mississippi State. So it's sort of a mini rivalry weekend this weekend. So Georgia, Florida, 3:30. Anyway, appreciate everybody watching. Have a good morning.